Guys, BHVR have proposed some crazy big changes to Dead by Daylight, and for the first time that I've ever seen from them, they actually are planning to use the PTB, the public test build, to actually test changes coming to Dead by Daylight in advance, rather than, you know, doing a PTB 3 weeks before an update comes out and hoping whatever they change in the game is good enough that they can just change a couple of things based on community feedback. So let's go over the changes coming to Dead by Daylight and talk about their implications, because these are massive. So it's a developer update, and basically the first change that we need to look at is Last Standing. It's a brand new status effect mode that happens in the game. So basically, when all other survivors are either dead, in the dying state, so that means slugged on the floor, hooked, or that they have escaped, you will become the last standing survivor. When you are in the last standing mode, your field of vision as survivor, and actually the killer's field of vision as well, it increases. So the screen zooms out a little bit to create a cinematic effect. Basically, if you manage to rescue a survivor from a hook, dying state, whatever, then the last standing phase will end. But if the killer manages to kill you whilst you're in the last standing phase, then a finishing Mori animation will begin. The survivor who is downed last and the killer will be teleported somewhere on the map where basically there's nothing in the way, and the killer will Mori that survivor and the game will end. And it's a brand new way for the game to end. Now, because the game can instantly end in a way like this, BHVR are changing the way that survivors interact when they are on the floor in the dying state. Basically, if you have been slugged for 45 seconds, you will now gain the ability to pick yourself up base kit without the need of perks. This is a massive balance change to Dead by Daylight, because it means that you do not need to bring Unbreakable, Boon Exponential to basically pick yourself up. That's crazy. That is a crazy change to the game. Now, because of this, they are going to be changing perks like Unbreakable. So Unbreakable will now increase the self-recovery speed of recovery to 100%. So instead of it taking 45 seconds to pick yourself up, it will now take 22.5 seconds. Because of this, they're actually removing the Moris from perks like Rancor and Hex Devour Hope, which I can't believe that they've decided to do, because I don't see why they need to do that. It's a bit weird. Moris, for example, no longer unlock the ability to Mori people because it's now base kit. However, if you manage to kill at least 2 survivors and the game ends with finishing Mori, then a Cypress Mori will give you 8,000 blood points. An Ivory Mori gives you 12,000 if you get at least 3 survivors killed and the game ends in a finishing Mori. And then the Ebony gives you 20,000 blood points if all 4 survivors are killed and the game ends with a finishing Mori. So it's basically blood point offerings now. And like I said, these changes are not coming to Dead by Daylight soon. Basically, next week there'll be a public test build. We'll get to test these changes. BHVR will take copious amounts of feedback, probably a lot of crying from the community, and they will work on this change or scrap this change based on the feedback. So what does this actually mean for Dead by Daylight? Because this is a huge balancing implications. Well, this is both killer buff, killer nerf, survivor buff, survivor nerf. It's a huge meta change. You can't look at it through the simple lens of this is a nerf to killers or a buff to killers, a nerf to survivors, a buff to survivors. Like, for example, if a killer has high pressure and the ability to down survivors quickly, let's say they're playing Nurse and they bring exposed perks like Haunted Grounds or Starstruck, or they're playing Oni and everybody manages to go down very quickly. A Cannibal manages to chainsaw everyone very quickly. Plague manages to red bomb on everybody very quickly. Then the game could instantly end in a moment due to the finishing Mori mechanic. If all survivors that are currently alive go down on the floor, then the game just ends regardless of what perks they have, regardless if an Execute is open, regardless if they have Unbreakable, regardless if they have perks like Decisive Strike, which would allow them to struggle off the killer's shoulder. The game just ends. Snowball killers can potentially end games extremely quickly with this new finishing Mori. But equally, survivors can now bring Unbreakable to pick themselves up within 22.5 seconds infinitely through the game. So that means a group of survivors could play with Sabo toolboxes, they could play with Breakout, they could bring Unbreakable, they could basically try to bully killers if they wish to, knowing that they can continuously pick themselves up pretty quickly, and they can try and abuse areas of the map where it's hard to hook survivors because of the fact that the hooks are far away, or, you know, that they have those toolboxes to threaten. So equally, there's like elements to this where survivors can utilize these mechanics in crazy ways. And then that's not even mentioning killers like the twins, who literally have to slug survivors for a good 20 seconds sometimes when they are trying to even down someone and pick them up. Like, you think about it. You down a survivor with Victor. It takes literally 6 seconds to switch back to Charlotte by the time you're in control of Charlotte and moving towards them. So that is not that much time to then get to the survivor. Depending on where you've downed them, they could potentially have picked themselves up by the time you get to them. That is a crazy thing. And that's not just a one-time thing. That is a multiple times thing throughout the game. So that means that they have to consider the balance, the individual killers with this new last standing mechanic. But if you think about it, this is also a massive buff to solo queue players as well, because solo queue players now become less reliant on their teammates to do the right thing in high pressure situations. They will now be able to pick themselves up between 22.5 to 45 seconds after going down. And that means that a teammate could potentially sit on a generator and could win a game through, letting their teammates sit on the floor for a little bit. It also removes the extremely annoying and frustrating thing in Dead by Daylight where a killer decides to power trip on survivors and leave them all slugged on the floor for 4 whole minutes before they bleed out. People would call this holding the game hostage, but because the game naturally ends after 4 minutes, Behavior have said, well, if they want to do that, they can do that. But let's be real. That's a real scummy thing to do to a survivor and a group of survivors just because you wanted to power trip on them or because you didn't like what they did in the game. I don't know what your justification for it is. That's no longer possible because if you manage to slug all 4 for survivors, the game just ends instantly. I suppose that is a change that you have to now think about. If you like to give the last survivor hatch, don't down the last survivor and carry them to the hatch. Now you have to wait for them to go get the hatch. I mean, I personally never got the fascination with giving mercy to the last survivor, but it's a common thing in Dead by Daylight. So now you have to change the way you play around that. This whole thing is a crazy change coming to Dead by Daylight. And I'm personally quite excited about it because when you have massive meta changes like this, it makes the game feel fresh again. And so whilst there are concerns right now, without even trying out the PTB for this change, without even getting to the point where this is in the game, yes, there's concerns. But this is quite an exciting thing, in my opinion, for Dead by Daylight. To the people that I see crying over this change, I've already seen people saying they're going to quit the game because of this change. Please remember that Behavior are actually attempting to test this in a public forum before it gets close to the game. And I get the criticism and I guess cynicism around the fact that Behavior probably worked on this for 6 months, so they're very unlikely to scrap it if it doesn't work well. But the whole point of putting it out there publicly months in advance is so that you can get a general reaction to the game and also see how it works in reality. And let's be real, guys. When you play Killer, how often do you slug? Like, genuinely. Unless you're going out of your way to slug, how often do you slug in your games? I personally hardly ever slug because, like I said, usually when you are in a position to slug multiple survivors, it's because the survivors have made a mistake. So at high level games, very unlikely that survivors make such a mistake that allow you to slug copiously. But I personally think that if you think about all the games of Survivor you've played recently and maybe all the games of Killer you've played recently, how does this actually realistically change the game in a significant way if you're not going out of your way to overly slug? If you're hooking survivors that you down relatively quickly, it doesn't change anything, really, does it? Apart from the small scenarios where maybe a Swift brings Sabo toolboxes and they play ultra aggressively, but if they're playing ultra aggressively, then they're not doing generators, so I guess there's a trade-off there. There's gonna have to be some considerations to perks like Breakout, to Sabo toolboxes, to hook spawns around the map. And I guess one relatively sad thing is that now One Pump Willie is out of a job because he can no longer slug survivors to get them condemned when you're playing Onryo. Sorry, mate. That's just not going to happen as much anymore, is it, really? Speaking about Onryo and Pyramid Head, their execution or the condemned stare, they're not Moris. They're like powers that allow you to kill the survivor quickly. A bit like Pig's Bear Trap. They will not be affected by this change at all. If you do manage to get 7 stacks of condemnation or you get to do the execution on Pyramid Head, those aren't Moris. They will stay in the game as they are. But obviously, strategies around that might change. Do I think this is a positive change for Dead by Daylight, or am I concerned about these changes? Well, it's hard to say without actually trying them out, because like I do say, I do think that in the most cases, it won't change the every game of Dead by Daylight, other than the fact that Moris will become a staple part and you'll get to see killers killing the survivors in an interesting way every time they play the game. And Moris will become less of a cool thing, but Moris have been less of a cool thing, I think, for a long time. Ever since Behavior decided to change Moris so that they no longer happen until you're on your dying state hook, Moris have been a whatever thing for me personally. I'm pretty excited for the PTB that's coming next week to try these changes, see how they implement the game. I would love to pair up with some people and try and break the system in ways such as, you know, bring Unbreakable, Sabo, Swift, all that kind of stuff, because it is important to stretch this to its extent. But also in the same regard, I'll be playing killers that have high pressure, high snowball, to see exactly how quickly I can end a game and how successfully I can be. Because I'm thinking about scenarios where there's 3 survivors remaining or 2 survivors remaining, and how you'll be able to relatively easily and quickly end some games because of this new last standing mechanic. It's interesting to say the least, and it will change the way Dead by Daylight is played, but that might be a good thing, really, because this game is getting old, and it's nice to see the game refresh. So, do these changes scare you, excite you? Are you quitting, or will this bring you back to Dead by Daylight? Leave a comment down below what you're thinking about these changes, and whilst you're down there, make sure you hit the thumbs up button to support the channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. And guys, like, think about this. During hardcore this year, do you think these changes would have made much of a difference to the season so far? I mean, we'll probably do a new season later this year with some North American folk, and so looking forward to that. But if you haven't watched hardcore, click the link here, watch the latest video, and let me know if you think these changes will affect hardcore, because that's quite an interesting concept, don't you think?